Hello and welcome back to the Opposites Abroad podcast, a podcast about all things travel. Today we are talking China and specifically the Chinese megacities. A few facts on China. It's got a population of 1.4 billion and it is 3.7 square miles, which makes it almost exactly the same size as the US. Apparently the definition comes down to what is considered land and water, and it's very confusing. So there's no doubt, especially with Trump coming in and antagonising China and China antagonising Trump, there'll be some debate about which is the third and which is the fourth biggest country in the world. But China is either the third or the fourth biggest country in the world, with the US taking up the other spot. TT, you've been to China a couple of times?
I have, once as a kid and then once right before I met you in North Korea.
Yeah, and we met in, well, we didn't actually meet, but we must have been in the same briefing room in Beijing, which is the capital of China. Shanghai is really the financial centre, I guess kind of in some ways, the more modern cultural centre. And the country has an insanely rich, deep history. They invented paper, writing, gunpowder, and many other elements of modern society. And we could go on all day about the history of China, and I think it's one of those countries you could keep visiting forever and never really understand. It's just so deep and rich. It's really one of the places where civilization was invented, I guess you could say. Albeit that was a rather long and drawn-out process. But so much of what we know in the modern world essentially came to be in China. But today we're focusing on the more modern element of it because they're the elements of China that we've visited and that we know. And those are the megacities. So, a small disclaimer: we try and be positive. We both love travel. We love travel. We love new places. I've been to China, I believe 10 times. It may be 11, but lots of times. Always to the megacities, and my impressions generally were not favourable. But people say that the rural areas are incredible. The people are incredibly welcoming in the countryside. I don't know, that may be the case, but we're going to tell you about our experiences in the big cities, and we're going to cover 7 Chinese cities, discuss each one a little bit, and also give our general impressions of the place. But your first visit to China, interestingly enough, was when you were a kid, and it's changed beyond all recognition. In the China I visited, I only went for the first time in 2016, and then went 3 times a year for 5 years. No, can't. My maths is out. I somehow went 10 times in the next 4 years. But you went when you were a kid, and it must have been a very different place.
Yeah, it's, China, like you're saying, is super interesting. It's got such an amazing history. And I remember reading the biography of Ripley from Ripley's Believe It or Not. And China was by far his most favorite place in the world. And he'd been all over the place. And that was the old China before it got, in my opinion, fairly destroyed after the Cultural Revolution, when Mao went in and destroyed a lot of monuments and a lot of the history and a lot of the old cities, and it's a shame that there's not as much history there as there used to be. When I went there, it was 1987, and it had just opened up for tourists. At the time, my dad had a job where he got tons of frequent flyer miles. So my mom was a teacher and had summers off, and she was trying to use up his miles. And we did an Asia trip when I was 12 years old, just my mom and I. And we went to China, and we stayed at the Hilton, and it had literally just opened up for foreigners. And it was very obvious, even when I was 12, that most people had never seen a Westerner. And there was crowds outside the hotel trying to get a glimpse of Westerners. Their jaws would drop. They would stare wherever we went. There's almost no cars. It was just masses of black bicycles with everybody dressed the same, very communist. Not a beautiful city. Not a lot of restaurants. It was like you picture China being probably in the 1950s. And it was very, very different than I was used to growing up in suburban America. I remember really struggling with the food. It wasn't quite as what we think of as American Chinese food. I remember eating a lot of rice when I was 12 years old. I wasn't super adventurous. And then when I went back, and the funny thing is, I remember that being like that. And then when I went back right before we went to North Korea, 7 years ago or whenever that was, I remember being really disappointed that it was so modern. Because when I went as a kid, there was no skyscrapers. There was hardly any cars. Everyone dressed the same, and it was and seeing it just turning into this huge, boring mega city of Beijing was just, I don't know, it's just kind of a bummer. And there's really not old parts of the city around. It's just everything's been, other than the Forbidden City, everything's pretty much been torn down, and it's just, there's some charm in the oldness of it when I was a kid, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that is fascinating because that does not bear much resemblance to the China that we're going to describe, and the Beijing that we both went to just before our trip to North Korea. By the way, we did an episode all about our trip to North Korea, so scroll back through the Opposites Abroad archives and you'll find that. But yeah, your description of Beijing does not chime with my experiences of the Chinese cities, and one of the general impressions I got from visiting China was I quite quickly became sad at what had clearly been done to the country, because you're there and you think this is the country that kind of invented civilization. It was at the forefront of everything that we now know in the modern world, and yet it's almost been reduced. Much as it's been built up, it's almost been reduced to this sprawling mass of skyscrapers and clogged roads and unhappy people and government surveillance. And you personally, when I was in China, I couldn't help but be quite angry at what had been done to what was clearly a magnificent country. And as you say, I think that began with Mao's Cultural Revolution. And if I could just make a book suggestion for anyone that wants to understand that process a little bit more, there's a fabulous book called Wild Swans, and it's a first-hand account of a lady who lived through the Cultural Revolution. Her father was a member of the Chinese Communist Party, but that didn't end well, as it generally didn't for people in Mao's time. And she lived through the Cultural Revolution and actually ended up moving to England and looked back on it with eyes anew and wrote this book, Wild Swans. It was a bestseller in the 1990s, and it's still an amazing insight into that process. But yeah, you are sad when you go to China and you see what an absolutely magnificent civilization has been reduced to. That was certainly my experience.
Yeah, I think, and not to get too political, but I think if you really are looking at going to China because you want to see the culture, I'd consider instead going to Taiwan.
Yeah, that's a good call, actually.
Which is not, and again, not to get too political, in my opinion, it's not part of China. It's an independent country, and Taiwan was created basically by the government that fled China when the communists took over, and it's cleaner, I think, friendlier, nicer, and a good way to get a sense of the food and the culture of China without the massive throngs of China.
Yeah, and Taipei is huge Asian megacity, but as you say, it feels like the people are happy with where they live, and there is still an element of freedom. Well, in fact, it's a very free country. You can live how you wish, and that's not really the case in China. And I've certainly found, by the way, we'll say the disclaimer one more time. We're talking about the megacities here. People who've explored rural China may not agree with our assessment. We're only describing the places we've been. But in the big megacities, of which I believe there are now 70 in China, which is just
wow,
unbelievable. The people are not super friendly on the whole. They're not. There isn't a lot of courtesy and politeness, and that may, to an extent, a cultural thing. But you don't get the impression that the people are genuinely happy with their lives. And I remember in China, I'd land, clear immigration, and then you kind of take a deep breath and you go, okay, now I'm going to start arguing with people. and you get in the taxi, and there's a debate about how much it is. And when I was working, we'd get a information pack, and it would say, look, the taxi should cost 200 RMB or whatever it was. And you get in, you say, how much is it to hit, with sign language? I'd show him the name of the hotel, and he'd write 1,000. No, I'd cross it out. I'd write 200. He'd try and kick me out the cab. So shouting at me.
Yeah, way different than Japan.
Yeah, exactly. And then eventually you settle on whatever. You get bored, and I'd say, okay, 300, whatever it was. And as soon as you get to the hotel, we generally found they would say, yeah, we don't have a room for you. And I'd say, well, I think you do. Here's my confirmation, blah, blah, blah. And they'd be back and forth, and eventually they'd find the room that they probably had all along and were just trying to put you off so they could sell it for a second time. And so it's my experience of the people in China was that they were not happy. The few people that could speak English that I sometimes would work with were not positive about where they lived. And that makes it quite a tricky place to travel, because everyone's just trying to carve out a little bit extra for themselves, or find a little win here or there. But it means that you're kind of always negotiating, to put it politely.
My experience with any either communist or pseudo-communist or ex-communist country is they're all kind of like that.
Yeah.
And it's not a knock on the Chinese. It's not a knock on anybody that from the Eastern Bloc or Russia or any of those countries. What it is, it's just a way that they had to develop in order to survive in these tough regimes that didn't give them enough food, didn't give them enough supplies, and they're trying to take care of their families. And they've just developed these cultures of trying to put themselves and get what they can because they couldn't get anything from their government. And I think it takes a lot of generations to get through that, even once those regimes fail. And I think that's part of what's happened with China.
Yeah, I think so. I think the people of China have had this done to them, and it manifests itself in how they deal with outsiders, as well as in many other ways. But it just makes you angry, because obviously when you've just got off a 12-hour flight, you're kind of angry at the taxi driver, and you'd really rather not be arguing, and rather not that you'd prefer he wasn't trying to charge you 5 times what it should cost. But you actually, once you've been a few times and had time to reflect, it just makes you angry at the government that's done this to people and made their lives this way. Because there is, for the average Chinese citizen, there isn't a lot of hope, and there isn't a lot of chance to climb the social ladder. China, as you say, is pseudo-communist, so it's a communist country where there are billionaires, so it's just a mess politically, and that's become a social problem.
And I will say that when I was in Beijing the last time, right before I met you, I got lost a couple times walking around Beijing, and this was kind of that weird time 7 years ago where there wasn't great smartphones that had maps and things like that. And I will say, when I stopped people on the street in China, in Beijing, they would stop and they would get their phone out and they would try to help me, and they would try to translate. They would call other people over to try to help me go where I needed to go. And I was really impressed with that. And I think that if you were a Chinese person in New York City trying to get help, you would have got far less help than I got from the Chinese in China. So I think deep down they are good people that want to do the right thing. They've just been brutalized by this communist government, and they're just trying to survive.
I think so, yeah. And a lot of the people I worked with could speak enough English that you could have a conversation about their lives. And the reality is they are fundamentally good people. I'm I guess an optimist in some ways. I believe that people generally are good, but as you say, you've got to survive. You've got to get through somehow, and sadly, it becomes a little bit every man for himself, a bit dog eat dog.
I remember when we were one time years ago, you told me that you really only need to know 2 phrases in China. Do you remember that?
I do, yeah.
Do you want to say what they are?
Yeah. Well, just for a little bit of context, I work in media, so we fly or we used to go to China for events and broadcast events, and we would have a lot of expensive, shiny broadcast equipment. And so I learned the phrase, I've now forgotten it in case you asked me to say it, but I learned hello, thank you, and don't touch that. Because we would open these cases and then sort of like a swarm of bees, all these people would descend on all this incredibly expensive camera equipment, and I would shout, don't touch that, in Mandarin. And it was amazing the reaction it used to get.
So say it in Mandarin. Let's hear it.
No, I can't remember. I just said I can't remember it. I need to look it up again if we go again. But yeah, actually a few times the people would go, oh, he said so, and then start talking to me in Mandarin, not realizing that by the time I'd said hello and don't touch that, all I had left was thank you in my Mandarin. But sometimes it would actually there'd be a bit of a giggle and you kind of have a bit of a sign language chat with people. So often much as it was kind of maybe a bit rude and yeah, now I say it sounds a little harsh, it did actually provoke some conversations. So yeah, that was the extent of my Mandarin.
That's good. Well,
yeah.
let's talk about food before we get on to the specific cities. So what's your impression on authentic Chinese food?
I did not find a lot of food I really enjoyed in China. I'd like to think I'm a reasonably adventurous eater, albeit, again, we've done an episode on eating while you're traveling, by the way. You can find that in our archives. I try and eat like a local. I am open to trying things. I'd like to think that without being stupid and whilst avoiding food poisoning, I'd like to think I'm quite an adventurous eater, but I did not find a lot of food that I enjoyed in the Chinese megacities. For sure, the low light was in Chongqing, which we'll cover later. The largest single metropolis on the world is Chongqing in Western China, and we went out for Chongqing hot pot, which even here in BC, if you go to certain parts of Vancouver, there's a lot of Chinese immigrants, and you can find Chongqing hot pot restaurants. So it's what the city's known for. And we went for Chinese hot pot. Chongqing hot pot, and I like spicy food as well. I like Indian food, curries, spicy Mexican food, and it came with a broth that you dip things in, and I cannot describe via the medium of a podcast how spicy it was, but I dipped whatever it was, a vegetable, in this stuff, put it in my mouth, and it was like my entire head was on fire, and I didn't even have that much. So, and the guys I was with didn't even like spicy food, so we started eating just the vegetables but not dipping it in this sauce of hell. And then as we were eating, we'd been eating a couple of minutes, and just a fish head suddenly just appeared in the broth, and had obviously been sort of bubbling around in the broth. And we just said, oh, you know what? I think we're done with this. I think we went and found a pizza or something. So, yeah, I struggled to find good food. We would often be eating in hotel buffets, and they weren't great. How about you? Tell me found some good food.
Well, I'm just curious, is there a lot of spicy food in the north of England?
There is,
curry.
Because a lot of the north of England has a lot of... So the town I went to school in, I don't know about white minority, but certainly has a big enough Indian population that's probably 50-50, sort of Indian, Pakistani / Caucasian. So towns like Bradford in the north of England have huge populations of Indians and Pakistanis, and so curry in the north of England is really popular. Most people in the north of England like hot, spicy food. So
yeah. I remember when I went to college for that semester in England, we had curry a few times a week for dinner, and I didn't understand at the time. Like, I thought it was so strange, but they didn't really explain that kind of the history of it. I just thought English food is more like shepherd pie and fish and chips and stuff, but it's good. I agree. It's really good.
Yeah, I mean, England obviously has a huge population of Indians and Pakistanis, so you grow up eating a lot of curry, and it's one of the I love curry. I love spicy food. But this,
I do too.
yeah. But the Chongqing hot pot was insane. It was like drinking hot sauce in the bottle.
So back to Chinese food. The night before you went to North Korea, where did you go out to eat?
Are you trying to get the confession out of me? So I went to Hooters.
Yeah, and I actually went to Chinese food. And then when you told me that, I was like, "Oh man, I should have gone to Hooters too," because I didn't really have that great of a dinner.
So I'd been working for 2 weeks in China.
Yeah,
and we'd been working in not quite as westernized and modern cities as Beijing. I don't remember, maybe Wujiang or somewhere. And I was pretty over second-rate, lukewarm hotel buffet food.
Yeah.
And we got to Beijing. I was walking down the street. I saw Hooters, and obviously it's sort of burgers, fries, ice cold beer, and I thought, that's me.
Yeah.
I know I'm only in Beijing for one night, but I'm just done with food I don't like.
That sounds.
I got to kill a burger.
Yeah. So, that sounds
no,
good.
I got no shame. I just needed it in that moment. I just needed it.
So I went to Chinese food, and of course, there's that old joke that, like, the dad joke. What do you call Chinese food in China? Food. So I went and had food, and yeah, it just wasn't that great. I think, and this sounds, I don't know even what the term would be, but I really like Americanized Chinese food. Like, they've just figured out a lot of mixtures together. People joke that everything's brown. It's all brown sauces and stuff. But some of these things they're just really, really good. And in China, they don't, in my experience, they don't use like a ton of spices when they cook, other than maybe like the hot pot stuff. So things are pretty bland. The meat's bland. A lot of it's boiled instead of like sautéed or in a wok. And it's just, I'm no expert in Chinese food, but it's not just that, it's not super exciting. As far as the Asian countries go, if I was going to do a food tour, I don't know that China would be super high on my list.
No, and one thing you should know about eating in China, particularly meat, is that they don't appear to differentiate between the parts of the animal. So if you order a chicken curry, for example, in England or really anywhere else in the world, you'll get the breast, you might get legs, bits of wing, but it'll be essentially real meat. Whereas in China, if they get a chicken, they just apply like a map grid pattern to it, and just chop it in 1 centimeter cubes. So the cube you get might be breast or leg, but it could also be the hip joint or the foot, or it could be anything. And so when you order meat in China, you will have 50% of it will be what we call meat, and 50% of it will be ligament and gristle and bone, and they'll all just be in together. And so it depends how fussy you are, but Westerners spend a lot of time putting each cubic centimeter down on the plate and pulling apart the bit they actually want.
Yeah.
So I feel bad saying this because I know there'll be great food in China, but you can only give your own experience. And I spent a lot of time in those big mega cities, and we did not find a huge amount of great food. And just changing the subject slightly, and before we go on to discussing some of the cities in detail, the one other thing that you really, really notice across China, or certainly across the mega cities, is the level of government surveillance. That's both CCTV and phone/internet control. There is, I don't remember the statistics, but there's something like one CCTV camera for every 3 Chinese people. The stat is something like that, or 1 in 4. And also, when you're in China, there's a firewall up, so you can't access Google, any social media. You can't use WhatsApp. You can actually get a VPN on your phone, so if you're not familiar with VPNs, it basically makes your phone behave as, or think that it's in the States or Europe or whatever. And so you can get access through that, but almost everything goes through WeChat, which is the Chinese app. So that's kind of a texting and payment system all in one. But obviously, with China being so strictly controlled, WeChat is subject to pretty stringent government control. And you can not only see the number of cameras, but the fact that your phone won't let you access many of the sites you normally use, the fact that really to communicate with anyone you have to download this app, which you also pay for stuff for, and is basically everything you type and everything you pay for can be viewed by the government. So that is something to be aware of and to know, and in my opinion, you do feel that.
So let's talk about the cities. And I've only been to Beijing. I've been there twice, but I don't have this experience from these other cities. So this is going to be more you giving your impressions. I kind of gave some of my impressions on Beijing, and I'll add a little bit to it. But let's start. Tell me what your favorite city is in China.
Shanghai.
And why?
It's the most westernized. There are some. So it feels more like Tokyo, Taipei. It feels more modern, more westernized. Yeah, it feels kind of out of keeping with the rest of China from what I've seen. It's the most modern and westernized. It's kind of the cultural capital of China. Fun areas to explore, some cool sights, and there's a really good brewery district as well, which is amazing. Don't ask me what it's called or how to find it, so you have to take my word for it. But there was a great area with kind of American-style breweries. That was super fun. Yeah, I like Shanghai the most, for sure.
Now, when you go to Europe and you go to the downtown or the old parts of European cities, a lot of them have these kind of medieval areas that are sometimes actually pretty big. Like in Latvia, they have this huge medieval part of town. When you're in these Chinese cities, these mega cities, are there parts of town that look like China from hundreds of years ago, or has that pretty much all been wiped out?
There are parts of most of the cities that look like China from hundreds and thousands of years ago, but I'm very skeptical that those are the original buildings.
Okay.
And I suspect that they were either recreated or have changed beyond all recognition. So we tried to get out and see places, and generally when you went to the old town or wherever it was supposed to be the historic part, I was unconvinced that was genuinely what the old part of town was. It had either been built from scratch or heavily modified.
Yeah, that's too bad, because I bet China in the 1800s was just amazing, these old cities.
Oh, but it was incredible. Yeah, and I'm sure if you go into parts of China where the government aren't very interested, so I'd be guessing if you go to areas where there are not rich in natural resources and where there isn't a lot of dissent against the government, and the government probably don't pay those regions much attention, I suspect it's absolutely amazing. But yeah, my experience of the so-called old towns was that they were not genuine, to put it mildly.
That's a shame. So after Shanghai, what's the second best?
Beijing. Yeah. Again, I don't just like places because they're westernized, but if you're talking about where would you actually want to spend your time, those Beijing and Shanghai just have enough westernization that you can kind of move around with a metro system, and you can probably survive and find different types of foods, and they feel more worldly. So Beijing was a close second. The pollution is pretty bad in both, but it feels like it's worse in Beijing.
I remember that being bad. I remember my nose running and a lot when I was in Beijing.
Yeah. But there's, as you know, there's a lot. There is a lot of history left. Some cool sites. Tiananmen Square's pretty great to see, albeit it's pretty tightly controlled.
Yeah.
And yeah, there's a good selection of restaurants and a metro system, and it's kind of easy enough to move around. But one thing about the Chinese cities is they're just so big, and there's very few landmarks.
Yeah.
So you just move around. You just can't tell where you are. You can't tell if you're north, south, east, west, where the center is. They're kind of unrelenting.
Yeah.
And that's much as I quite like Shanghai and Beijing. That's true of them as well.
Yeah, I remember that about Beijing. And then what comes after that? Is there a third, or are they all just kind of lumped in together, the rest of them?
I'm probably gonna have to lump them in together. Yeah, there's hang on. What, as they say in social media, wait for the end, because there is my least favorite city probably in the world coming up at the end. If we take out, like, when I say least favorite, the place I would like to live least is Pyongyang in North Korea. But of
but a normal city, yeah.
Cities that are just awful. I got one.
Okay.
Just wait for it. So, just to quickly touch on them, Xiamen, spelt Xiamen, is an island city on the south coast. I went there 3 or 4 times. It's okay, but again, just it goes on and on. And see, driving, I mean, it always used to occur to me, I don't know, we'd be working at an event, and then I'd say, oh, I heard that there's this district to check out. And you get in a cab and drive there. They could have driven for an hour, and it's a 5-minute drive, and you would have no idea. You just cannot tell where you've been. Sometimes we'd be driving along, and I'd be thinking, where the hell are we? You pull up and go, oh, that's the hotel. We're back. But it just, until we were literally outside the hotel, there was nothing to differentiate where we were.
Wow. So
we went to an Guangzhou Island, which is, again, supposedly historical, but again, I'm incredibly skeptical. The other city I went to 3 or 4 times was Wujiang. I was within driving distance of Shanghai. I think it was about 2 hours from Shanghai. We were making notes for this episode, and I couldn't come up with anything. It's just sprawling apartment buildings and factories, and that was it.
Isn't there a wet market there?
Yeah, I believe there is. I did actually. I don't remember where it was, but I went to a wet market once, and it was horrific.
I bet.
Like bags of live frogs, just sort of on the sidewalk. Just awful animal cruelty. I think it could have been in Wujiang. But there was a big lake near where we used to stay in Wujiang, and like there'd be a lot of dead fish floating in it. I don't know what had killed them or whatever, but it's not what you want to see. And then also quite close to Wujiang, well, quite close, 4 hours away. One of the places actually I enjoyed and would like to have seen more of is Nanjing. So that had a fun downtown area, incredibly modern. Apparently at the turn of the previous millennium, so not 25 years ago, but 1,025 years ago, Nanjing was the biggest city in the world.
Oh wow!
And one of the most important cities on the planet for a long time, for thousands of years. But again, if you find yourself there, the downtown is nice enough. I'm really not providing a lot of value on this podcast, but I can only give my experience. Slightly having run through 3 places that are completely forgettable in Xiamen, Wujiang, and Nanjing. Tai'an is T-A-I''. Tai'an. Bit fun, smaller, exceptional hiking around Mount Taishan, just north of town. I had some great hiking days. Quite like Tai'an. And then the other place just to touch on before we get to my low light was Guangzhou. Again on the south coast. We went to one of the ghost districts. So in China, the government build districts of the city before anybody gets there. So they know, I don't know how this process is completed, but the government know they're going to basically fill these areas. So they build the apartment buildings, they build the shopping malls, they build the leisure facilities, but no one's yet arrived. And it is in Guangzhou we experienced that, and it is one of the strangest things ever. We rented bicycles, and we're on 3-lane highway, just zigzagging along the highway just on bicycles, and there are no cars. And we went in a shopping mall, and it's got shops, had a CrossFit gym, everything's got staff, and there are literally no people apart from the staff. And the apartment buildings are empty. It's like that movie 28 Days Later, where London is abandoned and everyone comes back.
Yeah.
It's to be in a city that's fully functioning but has no people is utterly surreal. And that was what happened in Guangzhou. I'm sure now, that was 9 years ago. I mean, I'm sure now it's just packed and just like every other city, but that was definitely a weird experience.
So what is the worst?
Chongqing.
Tell us about that.
So the largest single metropolitan area in the world is Chongqing, and there are basically 30 million people in one big valley in western China, and it is unrelenting skyscrapers, roads, and pollution. It literally all looks the same. You cannot tell where you are. There are no landmarks. There are a couple of kind of interesting modern buildings, but you arrive at them, but you could never find them again. So you say to the cab driver, I want to go to X, and he takes you to X, but I don't know where they were in relation to the rest of the city, because obviously Google, even if you could access Google, when you get home and you go on Google, you can't get 3D in China, you can't Street View. Go on Google Maps, anyone listening to this, look at a Chinese city, and it's really vague. The definition is very poor, so you can never really figure out where you are, but it's just unrelenting. And the pollution is insane. On our hotel windows, there'd just be this sort of brown dust, and they clean them quite often, but then a week later, this brown dust is back on the windows, and there's only one place it's coming from, and that's pollution. So the spot where the Jialing and Yangtze rivers meet is quite cool, but otherwise it feels like the biggest metropolitan area in the world. When I was doing some research for this, by the way, I found out the metropolitan area is the same size as Austria.
Wow.
And when I remember coming into land at Chongqing, and you kind of come down through the clouds, and you start flying over this mass of grey and brown buildings with you could see the black pollution air below you, and you're probably still at 10,000 feet. You're not even on kind of final approach, and the city. You come out the clouds and the city has already begun, and you fly. Well, it's the size of Austria. You fly a long way, and it's just still going. So, yeah, Chongqing, my least favourite city I've ever been to. So there you go. And I blame the Chinese government, because again, it was in Western China at even 100 years ago. I bet it was a fascinating trading outpost. And it's just been turned into this industrial hellhole, and it's the fault of the Communist Party.
So if you were talking to someone, they wanted to go, and they've never been to Asia, and they want to go to an Asian city on a trip, where would you recommend that they go? Kind of end it on a positive note.
Tokyo, Taipei. Never been to Seoul, but apparently that's great. Never been to Bangkok. People seem to like that. We talked about Tokyo quite a bit already, even though we haven't done an episode on it. I got a lot of love for Tokyo.
Yeah, I do too.
When we met up in Taipei, I enjoyed that. How about you?
I would say Tokyo is probably the best for just safety, cleanliness, polite people, ease of getting around. Tokyo is just, it's a culture shock from the way that it's interesting, but it's not a culture shock in the way that it's difficult to deal with. And then I do think Bangkok is great, especially if you're really into food and you're into temples and things like that. Bangkok is great, but those are the two that I would recommend probably.
Yeah, I think so. Tokyo is great in that it's a cultural shock. Everything's different. It's unlike anything you'll find in Europe or North America, and yet you can drink the water. Everyone's polite. Yeah. It's clean. You're not going to get food
You're not
poisoning.
going to get robbed.
You're not going to get robbed. There's no crime. The metro signs are in English as well as Japanese, which isn't the case in all the Japanese cities. So you can move around. So you get the cultural experience, but it's not insane.
Yeah, and people are polite. There's not a tipping culture, so people will help you without putting their hand out for money. Another one I would recommend just for safety and things to do and cleanliness is Singapore. Singapore is really safe, and everyone speaks English in Singapore, which they don't in Tokyo. I think and Singapore is known for their amazing food and their fine dining and their street food. I think Singapore is a really safe bet too. But those are probably the ones that I would recommend.
Yeah, and I suspect pre-handover we probably would have added Hong Kong to the list.
And actually I'm leaving for Hong Kong in a few days, so
all right, well, stay tuned. We'll cover
because
that
I went as a kid on the same trip. I went to China, and I don't really remember a lot about it, but I'm excited to see what it is now. So we'll do an episode on that soon.
Yeah, that sounds great. Okay, well, hopefully it's a little more positive, but you can only tell it how you see it. China was, and in pockets probably still is, one of the most fascinating places on the planet, and full of good people. But when you go to these mega city metropolises, you are probably not going to like them very much. So you got to tell it how it is. And yeah, sadly, I didn't get on with it much. But one day, hopefully, we can figure out a trip where we go to some really cool, quiet little bit of China that no one's ever heard of, and we'll do a podcast saying how great it was.
Yes. Well, we've talked about I'd love to go to Mongolia.
It's on the list. It's on the list.
Yeah.
If time and funds permit.
Well, yeah, we'll have to do that one day.